Okay, so welcome to an Introduction to Judaism, the history, Jewish history big picture. We are now on chapter 22. And so I wanted to get us started today. This chapter 22, is a difficult one to read because it is the one about the Holocaust. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Theoretically. There we go. This is taking longer than I wanted to because it just is. Okay, now we are sharing screen. So here's chapter 22. We're going to do chapter 22 and 23. So we're actually almost finished with the Jewish History Big Picture book. And we'll discuss today actually the Holocaust and then the founding of Israel. So the two happen close in time. So that's probably the reason why the two chapters are next to each other. And they're also somewhat related. We'll see why. So the Holocaust, from the moment that he took power in Germany, Adolf Hitler made the rebuilding of the German military a top priority. And so in the process, he constructed a powerful war machine. And it should be noted that at the beginning, the two aims were apparent of, internationally, he was known to be interested in an annexation. And internally, he was known to be engaged in discrimination and eventually a war against the Jewish population. Also, other populations within Germany and the areas that he ended up occupying. That same war was against the Roma, which are known as gypsies, against those who were incapacitated mentally or physically. And, he also didn't, targeted homosexuals, communists, socialists, a few other groups. But the war against the Jews was a particular that consumed most of the resources. So we're going to look at what happened. So with each new conquest, a larger percentage of Europe's Jews fell under his control. So first in 1938, Germany annexed Austria, Anschluss, which brought in 200,000 Jews. Then in 1939, it seized Czechoslovakia, which was 360,000 Jews. When World War II began, it was on September 1st, 1939, when the German forces struck east into Poland. That's Blitzkrieg, and that was 3 million Jews. The Polish Jewish population was one of the largest in the world. And so 3 million Jews suddenly overnight became part of Nazi Germany. So we start, of course, with the timeline. We have that in the introduction. Oh, I forgot to mention what you're looking at is it just looks like a dark pile here. These are shoes. These are individual shoes from one of the death camps, one of the concentration camps, where they were doing an extermination of the Jews through use of gas chambers. So they then just throw the shoes over this wall. And as you can see, it's a huge pile. The people in this picture, you can't quite see, they come up to about here. You can see where my head, so that's an enormous pile of shoes. Okay, so here's our timeline. 1938 is Kristallnacht. We'll describe what that is in just a second. Those were the attacks against Jews that took place throughout Germany. 1939, World War II begins in Europe. 1940 is when the Nazis established the Warsaw Ghetto. We'll discuss the ghettos in a moment. In 1941 at Baba Yar, the 33,000 Jews were massacred. That's also the year that the United States entered into World War II after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And then in 1943 is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. 1945 is when Germany surrenders to the Allies. Japan surrenders after the United States drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's when World War II ends. So this is it's not a huge long time. I mean, in terms of the world time, but it was more than long enough. Yeah, more than long enough. So Kristallnacht. Here you actually see a plaque, and one of the things that the Germany of today is doing is making a point of putting up these plaques and identifying and acknowledging what had happened there. I'll read it for you in just a sec. So the Night of Shattered Glass took place on November 9th in 1938. What happened was this was a pogrom. Pogroms, to qualify as a pogrom, is violence against individuals for ethnic or religious reasons, that it is also supported by the state, either tacitly or explicitly. So that means that if you go to the police are like, no, I'm not going to help you. So the government-supported pogrom was involves many similar attacks against Jews throughout Germany. It was synagogues and homes were destroyed, stores were looted, thousands of Jewish men were rounded up and taken away to concentration camps. At this point, they're not extermination camps, they're concentration camps. What they would do is be used as slave labor, but this is before the gas chambers had started. The Jews who could leave sought refuge elsewhere in Europe, in Palestine, and the United States. So actually, when you look at percentages of what populations were affected, German Jews are not affected in the greatest percentages because this was their signal, it's time to go. And then so what this says is, this synagogue is 100 years old and was on the 9th of November, 1938, in the Kristallnacht, set on fire. During the Second World War from 1939 to 1945, it was in the year 1943, somewhat destroyed, like it was bombed, and it got bombed. The Todesfront, I don't know what that is, of the forefront of it, the forepart of it. It should always remain here, is what it's saying. And never forget. Vergesst nie is what it is here, never forget. And that was put there by the Jewish organization for Great Berlin, meaning like the Greater Berlin, like the way we say Berlin Metro or Berlin Greater area. And that was, as you can see, put in September of 1956. And that was in celebration partly, but also in memorial. The celebration part is the fact that it was founded in 1866? 66. So September 1966. So that gives you an idea of the timing for that. So this is one of the synagogues in Berlin that have been affected, and a historic spot. Okay. World War II. Before World War II began, Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed not to go to war against each other. That was not something that Germany actually intended to fulfill. Ribbentrop is the one who arranged that. What was happening was that Hitler simply wanted to defeat the other armies before confronting the Soviets. So by early 1941, Great Britain stood alone against Hitler. But then in June 1941, Hitler broke the pact and attacked Russia. Hitler had joined forces with Italy and Japan. After Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, that's when the United States entered the war. So what happened was, it was a smaller war. Then Hitler now faces three foes simultaneously: Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, which is part of the reason why by 1944, Germany started losing the war. Now, essentially what was happening is you had, in addition to this territorial expansion by the Nazis, you also had a very targeted war against the Jews. As soon as the war began, the Nazis moved rapidly and methodically against the Jews. They would pack Jews into overcrowded ghettos that they were not allowed to leave. So this is a picture of one of the ghettos. And I believe this one's in Lublin. I'd have to go back and look. But what happens is, and you can kind of see in this picture, it's hard to see perhaps too well, but they are all very thin. What's happening is the people in this ghetto are slowly starving. They packed in too tightly. So, basically they'd put twice the population that had been living there into a small place, or three times the population, so that everything was too crowded, and then not provide enough food and seal it off so that it wasn't possible to leave. And so it got dirty and crowded very quickly. Other Jews were forced into concentration camps where they were used as slave labor for the German war industries. Others were beaten, starved to death, or shot. It is in this period of time, at about 1941, when special mobile killing forces traveled behind the German army as it stormed into the Soviet Union, especially in Ukraine. And these special killing forces, these are the SS, this is why the SS was organized, would do things like have mobile vans, and they would arrange for mass killings, such as at Baba Yar. And there was this large ravine where 33,000 Jews, 33,000, it's a lot of Jews. I mean, that's a lot of people, were robbed of their valuables, stripped, and then lined up and shot. And so they shot all, and just let waves of bodies fall into it. What happened, and part of the reason why there was we'll get to the final solution in a moment. One of the things that they were aghast at or upset about, the Nazis, was that the mobile units, actually, this is very taxing on them emotionally. They found it very challenging to shoot people because, face to face at close range is actually harder to do than it sounds. Mercifully, that's good. They were having qualms of conscience, and that was wearing on them. So that's when they started creating these trucks that were like little mobile gas chambers to try to be more efficient about it and to be less hands-on. And eventually, you have the final solution. By the end of 1941, the Nazis had worked to death, starved, shot, or gassed about 1 million Jews. But what they wanted to do is actually kill all of the Jews everywhere in Europe. So when Hitler saw that no country would accept masses of Jewish refugees, he became bolder in his plans. And so in 1941, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, he and other high-level officials began discussing a final solution, which was a plan to murder all of the European Jews. And what they were going to do is create these camps, extermination camps, such as Auschwitz, where they would have trains come straight in, do a selection immediately, not try to feed and house the people, put them straight away into, those who could not work, put them straight away into gas chambers where they could kill hundreds or thousands at once. And also could do it with less wear and tear on their SSR officers, because they were concerned about their mental health, and could get other prisoners to do the difficult jobs of, like, say, taking the bodies out of the gas chamber and bringing them to the crematoria where they would be burned. And also, just all of that work, all of that stuff. And so then it could be done with minimal oversight. This is all really very difficult. By the spring of 1942, the Nazis had built a series of extermination camps in such places as Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz. Huge gas chambers were built, enabling camp officials to use poison gas to murder hundreds of Jews at once. So they would, basically take them they would strip them and tell them it was a shower, and then put it, and then shut the door, and turn on Zyklon B gas to cause the death of the people inside. These are two children who died in gas chambers, having been, they were living in the ghetto, which is why they look ragtag. It didn't last forever. The liberation, by 1944, Germany was clearly losing the war. And so in June, after the unprecedented landing at Normandy, the Allied forces began driving east toward Germany. And the Soviet forces were also, had pushed Germans out of the Soviet territory and were rolling west toward Germany. So what ends up happening is that on April 30th, 1945, with the Soviet army closing in on Berlin, Hitler shot and killed himself. So did his mistress, Eva Braun. The Germans then surrendered on May 7th. It took a while, though, for the extermination camps to be liberated. They were liberated by the Allies. The first was Brzandek. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In Lublin, Poland, which is July 1944. It took about a year to liberate everything, to get all the places. So the picture, by the way, is these are women who had been part of a camp, and these are women in the DP camp who are helping fit them with shoes. And as you can see, they're still very thin, but they've been given food and been able to clean up, and we're starting to work their ways towards having some connection to humanity again. Yeah, my own grandparents, my grandfather on my mother's side was shot by a German sniper in the Battle of the Bulge in 1945, February 1945, very end of February. My other grandfather, who served, was just outside of Pearl Harbor and watched it. You know, he was on a ship just outside of the harbor. But I don't, have family. We do have members of our congregation who have family who were affected by the Holocaust, who lost family members or who had family members who survived. That's not uncommon in a congregation of this size to have that happen. And one of the things that would happen is I met in my previous congregation, one of the gentlemen there was one of the kinder transport kids. There was an attempt to save, that was effective, a number of German children by taking them to Great Britain, and what was called the kinder transport, without their parents. And so he left his parents at a very young age and was saved by being brought to Great Britain. And he does not know the date that they died. So when we do his yard site, it was Yom HaShoah for his parents. The death toll of the European Jews. Poland was 2,700,000. You'll recall before the war starts, it was 3 million. So all but 300,000 are killed in the Holocaust. Poland is the country that the Jews of Poland were affected the most, both in terms of percentage and total numbers. It was the worst there. Soviet Union, 2,100,000. Hungary was 559,250. You'll notice Germany, 144,000 is not a high number in comparison, because most of it was slow enough moving for Germany that they could get out. And you can see that countries that had a greater advance warning, who were under German control later, had more options. So you see, like France, for example, is a lower number. The one that's remarkable is Denmark. You see, it's 116. There had been, I think it's about 5,000, maybe as many as 7,000 Jews. It was in that range, under 10,000, more than 5,000 Jews in Denmark. But what happened with the Danish Jews, why the number is so low, is that the Danish people completely resisted, absolutely resisted, and saw it, part of their theology was this idea that you had a responsibility to your neighbor. So they would do things like, most of the Jews were living in the cities, but they would just they would help move them out into the countryside where they wouldn't be found, or across the channel, although that's a big deal, to neutral countries. And so that's part of the reason why most of them survived. And in fact, in the 116, a few of them are heart attacks, what might not having been caught by the Nazis, but just the fear and terror of it causing the death, as opposed to the Nazis catching them. So it was possible to resist, Denmark shows. Although in the case of like Poland, for example, one of the things that happened with Poland is that they had the Blitzkrieg, so that they got controlled immediately. Also, when Jews tried to return to Poland after the war, although many did not, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism. So the population wasn't going to resist, didn't see a reason. And so there you see the difference between, how the population thought about the Jews among them. would matter in terms, could be a life or death thing. Are there questions about this? This is, I kind of went headlong into it because it's hard to talk about. We just had this last Thursday night into Friday was Yom HaShoah. Shoah is the word that's used in Hebrew for Holocaust. Holocaust means like a sacrifice that's burned whole, which is, whereas Shoah has more this connotation of catastrophe. And so anyway, the Holocaust Memorial Day was Thursday into Friday. And so it's something that's on our minds as a result. Questions? Okay, I'm going to move into chapter 23. So after the war, what happens is millions of people have been displaced. It's, you know, it wasn't just Jews that are displaced. Millions of people are displaced, including hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors. And that, you know, created both a challenge and an opportunity. You'll hear what the opportunity was. The Allied armies and the UN, its refugee and rehabilitation, I think is the two R's, provided aid for displaced persons. Many of the Jews, though, refused to go back to their home country. And it's not hard to see why. You know, like if your entire family had been murdered by the Nazis, your life has been shattered. It's not like you're going to go back to an existing business that you had or an existing house that you had. And it happened that with some would return and find that they were not wanted. And sometimes because the community, like in the sense of, you know, try to go back to the house and there'd be somebody living in it. But also, as I said, in Poland especially, there was continued anti-Semitism. So what happens is the Jewish underground soldiers and soldiers from the British Army's Jewish Brigade secretly help move survivors across the Polish border to DB camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. And then they try, and their next move from there is to engage in what was really oftentimes illegal immigration into what was then called Palestine. So here's your timeline. So 1946, just after the war, Irgun is there's three militias that are active in Palestine at this time that are Zionist. This one is headed up by, one of its key people is Menachem Begin, somebody you would recognize. But they bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. He's the one who's responsible for that. In 1947, the boat Exodus 1947 set sail for Palestine, carrying more than 4,500 Jewish refugees. The UN General Assembly that same year votes to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. 1948 is when the independent monarchical state of Israel is established. 1949, Israel holds its first election. Operation Magic Carpet begins. Occasionally you start to make a typo and it decides what you mean and you don't really, because it's not underlined. Okay. Bringing about 47,000 Jews from Yemen to Israel. Okay. So this is a picture of the King David Hotel. This is a modern picture of it, but, and as you can see, it's been rebuilt. So what happens is there was this underground resistance intended to undermine the British rule there. The Jewish underground militias in Palestine used force to pressure Britain to change its policies. So for 18 months after the war, the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lechi sabotaged railroad tracks, attacked police posts, airfields, and radar installations. They were causing, sort of infrastructure or snafus for the British Army to undermine their rule. The British sent 80,000 troops to Palestine to quash the violence and round up the attackers. So they weren't messing around. Cooperation among the Jewish militias fell apart, however, after the bombing of the British military and civilian headquarters at Jerusalem's King David Hotel on July 22nd, 1946. So they bombed that hotel there. About 90 people were killed. And there was a variety of people. It was some of them were British, some of them were Arab, some of them were Jewish. It was somewhat indiscriminate. Begin claimed that they'd given warning, but the other militias were aghast. And the Yishuv means the settlement. We talked about Yishuv before. The leaders of the Yishuv, the group that's there, did not want an all-out war with the British, and even urged parents to turn in their own children if they joined one of the militias, because especially after this bombing, they were horrified. Beautiful hotel, by the way. If you've ever been in the lobby, it's just gorgeous. Well, so there's still the Jewish refugee problem. Even after the war, the British refused to abolish the White Paper of 1939. Remember, that's the one that had said that shouldn't, they basically backtracked on the Balfour Declaration, and refused to allow DPs to immigrate to Palestine. So what was happening was the Haganah, one of those militias, brought thousands of DPs to Southern Europe, where once they sailed to Palestine. In 90% of the cases, the British would stop the ships before they reached Palestine, but not always. And some of them, it should also be mentioned, had guns on them. They wasn't just people. In January 1947, Britain handed over the problem in Palestine to the UN, which created the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. And that the UN was that's how the UN got involved in making the decision of what was supposed to happen next. Questions so far?
So what happened? So Britain just said they didn't see a winning solution there, and that's why they handed it over.
Yeah, because part of the problem was Britain had made competing promises to Jews and Arabs. They needed Arab oil, but they also felt, like you'll see with the Nexus 1947, there was also this sort of feeling of the Jewish claim, especially the really, like a good part of it was also, as you see in this next story, is that the refugees from Europe didn't want to be resettled. Like if you came from Poland and you were taken to a concentration camp and then you survived, and you then are in a DP camp, one of the displaced persons camps, and the idea is you're now going to be returned to, say, Lublin, or one of the cities in Poland that you lived. You're like, no, last place I want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask them, and this isn't true of all of them, but especially the Polish one, because remember in Poland, the Polish Jews had been the most committed to Zionism. I mean, they were also the most, like the population split between really religious, traditional religious, and rather secular, profoundly secular Zionists. But the secular Zionists of the group are going like, Palestine is it. Some of them would want to go to places like, the United States, for example. But, that's part of the reason why you will sometimes see, in the United States, especially along the East Coast, survivors, you'll meet survivors. But here's what sort of turned the tide on the public opinion was the Exodus 1947, which was a renamed former American passenger ship, which set sail from France in July 1947 with over 4,500 Jewish refugees aboard, including children. And when it gets to Palestine, the British destroyers ram it. They treat it as an enemy ship, and the crew members board it. And so what ends up happening is you have this little battle on the ship with, the passengers trying to defend themselves, but without arms. And two refugees, so far as I know, I'm not quite positive that they didn't mention it in the book, and I'm not remember. I have to go back and look again if they had any arms on the ship or not. I don't think this one did. Two refugees and one Jewish crew member died, and 30 people were injured. So people got hurt in this process. The British then towed the ship to Haifa's harbor, forced the refugees onto British ships, and then returned them to Europe. So they're supposed to go back to DP camps in Europe. Well, they reached Europe and the passengers refused to disembark, and they go on a hunger strike. They're like, Palestine or bust kind of thing, but not just simply because this idea of, well, Palestine is where we want to be. It's like, like we've gone through hell. we at least get to be self-determining now.
Right.
And so what happens is that swayed world opinion in favor of the Zionists, because everybody was like, what are you going to do? These people, because these are people who had, just months ago been emaciated skeletons of people. How are you going to say to them, I'm sorry, but you're going to need to go back to Poland? And it wasn't like Poland was clamoring to say, yay, let's have them. And it wasn't like Great Britain wanted, like nobody wanted them, to be clear, because refugees are always challenging. I mean, well, that's a longer story. I personally think you should take refugees always, but that's me. The UN plan. So the UNSCOP, Scott, presented in 1947 the report which recommended the cessation of the British mandate. Because remember, Britain had taken over control from the Ottoman, when the Ottoman Empire fell apart. Britain and France sort of divided it up. A majority of the committee members backed the partition of Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international authority. So that was the original plan. The Arabs were outraged, absolutely outraged, did not agree with this at all, and threatened war. They outnumbered the Jews 2-1 in Palestine, yet were only about 45% of the territory. So they wanted to know why they should pay the price for Europe's persecution of the Jews. Because, part of what was moving this idea was the what are we going to do with these displaced persons? And so the Arabs were like, we didn't do it. The Jews, who believed that they'd been promised a much larger territory by the Balfour Declaration, and that's not totally out, they're not wrong about that. Nevertheless, accepted the partition plan. There's a quote, and I believe it's Ben Gurion, of even if it's a tablecloth in size, we'll take it, which promised them self-rule. That's why, and unlimited immigration. That's also why. It was like, even if it's a tablecloth, we'll take it because it's self-rule. On December 29th, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on the partition plan. The final vote was 3-3 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. In Jewish movies and other media, you will sometimes see this enacted as a like in a dramatic theatrical moment, like people keeping track of who said yes and paying attention, because this is one of those moments that was momentous, especially for people especially people who are Zionists. What happens is, this is Ben Gurion. Again, we don't get his hair, which sticks straight up. And what happens is, on the morning of May 14, 1948, the British lowered their flag at the government house in Jerusalem, and at 4 p.m., the Jewish leaders gathered in Tel Aviv Museum under a portrait of Theodor Herzl. Ben Gurion bangs the gavel to bring the gathering to order, and they spontaneously begin singing Hatikva, that song. I was going to try to sing it, and then I was like, oh, I need the words in front of me. But they break out into Hatikva. Ben Gurion then read the Scroll of Independence, announcing the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael to be called the State of Israel, Medinat Yisrael. Okay, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Rabbi, why didn't France after the war, or maybe Britain after the war, really try to bring in a lot of the refugees into their own countries? Is it that they were probably didn't have the resources?
Well, that's some of it, actually. I mean, part of the reason why, for example, like, probably, I don't know what the internal conversation was, but I do know that, for example, one of the reasons why Britain was looking to get out of having the mandate was that they were getting exhausted financially. They had just gone through a very destructive, very difficult war. This war destroyed a lot of infrastructure, because remember, Great Britain was bombed by, and the Nazis engaged in all kinds of bombing across their cities. France there were large parts that were war torn and destroyed. And they're all trying to rebuild their economies and try to pull back out of this destruction around them. So that's a lot of, I made that a side comment of, I always think you should take in refugees, partly because refugees from the moral point of view, and partly because, actually, believe it or not, Immigrants will help your economy. People don't always feel that way though, because immigrants also bring in foreignness and they want to keep their country the way they are. Like they fear another language, another cuisine, another way of looking at things. And the more foreign they are, the harder it is to integrate them, in the sense of, they might stay as enclaves, they might stay as voting blocks, they might not assimilate into the larger culture, and then that becomes its own problem and can be a long-standing problem. And so these are the kinds of things they're thinking about, and they don't have the way to have refugees integrate is to spend money on them. And in fact, one of the things we're going to see when we look lower is Israel takes in everybody, takes in a massive influx of refugees. And it does it with some success, but also with some real genuine issues. And one of the things I'm going to show you when we get towards the end is the pushback of, I came to you as a refugee and you weren't good to me. And so so my throwaway comment is flip, in the sense of, I'm not on the hook to figure out how to feed and clothe and house them and teach them English in the case of Great Britain, and figure out how to make them into productive members of society. So it's easy for me to say.
Was anti-Semitism an issue in France and England?
Probably. And that's probably also was an issue for the United States as well. Yes. And also remember that the people who are coming in are destitute. Like, not only has everything they ever owned been either burned, destroyed, or stolen, but they're also only recently not starving.
Yeah.
So that, they're a challenge. It's not obvious what to do with them. And that's hard. Okay. Israel's war of independence. Before we get to the refugee problem that Israel faced, we're going to have to talk about the war. So early on May 15th, 1948, Egyptian fighter planes attacked Tel Aviv. That's the start of the war. Arab armies from neighboring countries launched an invasion on 3 fronts. By early June, the Israelis had gained strength, stopping the Egyptian advance in the south and repelling attacks from Syrians and Iraqis in the northeast. Israel made important gains in the later stages of the war, capturing the Negev in the south and widening the narrow corridor of land between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, because it had been just this little teeny bridge. By the time the fighting ended, Israel controlled 80% of Palestine. Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, so the city was divided in half, including the Old City. So Jordan had complete control of the Old City, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. And so that was where things ended. There was never actually a formal peace treaty, by the way. It was just a ceasefire. And that's where things were up until 1967. We'll talk about that later, but not today. What also happens, though, is that creates refugees from the Palestinian refugees. And what Israel calls the War of Independence is known in Palestinian history as the Nakba, or catastrophe. During the war, more than 700,000 Arabs fled or were forced from their homes in the territory that became the State of Israel. The early lore of the country was that they all fled, but later history, careful history and work, has established that no, actually, that's not the case. In some cases, that large amounts of population were forced from their homes. There were villages, especially, that were liquidated, not in the sense of the people still live, but they were removed. And so Israel does bear some responsibility for this. When the war was over, the Israeli government would not allow them to return. The Israelis feared that the Arabs would not support the Jewish state and might eventually become the majority. And that's been an ongoing concern. The more than 150,000 Arabs who remained in Israel, meanwhile, were officially granted equal rights under the Israel's Scroll of Independence. In practice, the government was suspicious of their loyalty. So it's been, they're citizens, but they're not entirely equal. So you do get examples, you do get these shining examples of Arabs who are fully participating, like physicians in the hospital system are very common, or there's occasionally Arab members of the parliament as well, the Knesset. So it's not that they don't get to participate or they aren't citizens, but at the same time, Israel has a strong tendency to prefer its Jewish population in a number of ways. So there's some really good Israeli TV written by Israeli Arabs about their situation. So like I got to see some of these episodes, and I'll have to remember what the name of the show was so I can tell you, but it was very good. And it was, basically investigating these claims and these the sort of dual loyalties that you feel in this situation. What also happens at the same time is that there's this flood of newcomers. When the hostilities were over, one of Israel's greatest challenges was absorbing waves of immigrants. Now, you already heard about the immigrants from Europe, what was happening there. You have a wave of immigrants who are displaced persons from the war, or who are survivors. And so you have this, as you see, nearly half of the newcomers were Holocaust survivors. So you're looking at 350,000 Holocaust survivors suddenly flooding the country. But what you also have happened is when Israel gets founded, the Jews in the Middle Eastern and North African countries also get expelled. So they go to Israel as well. So Yemen and Morocco and Iraq and places like that. What ends up happening is Israel organizes these sort of airlift processes to bring them in. So the immigrants that arrive from Middle Eastern and North African countries, you look at us, you have more than 600,000 Mizrahi, that's the Eastern, the Jews from the Eastern are called Mizrahi, which is Eastern, had settled in Israel, such as the secret airlift called Operation Magic Carpet, which had about 47,000 Jews from Yemen were brought to Israel. And between 1950 and 1951, you have 120,000 Jews who were evacuated to Israel from Iraq in Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, the Operation Magic Carpet, the Jews from Yemen, especially, well, any of these actually, the Jews that come from places like Yemen are have a very different culture than the Jews that come from Europe. Like those two cultures are I've long I'll give you an example, but it's a small one. If you take a lemon, if you are Ashkenazi, if you come from Europe, you probably, and you're going to use a lemon in your holiday meal, it's probably part of dessert and it's sweet. If you're going to take a lemon in your Mizrahi, it's not going to be sweet. It's going to be part of the main dish and it's going to be sour. Those are just small differences, but there's a number of them, like what prayer book you use and what order the prayers, how you do observe Passover, how you observe some of the aspects of high holidays. A number of those things, but also cultural differences in terms of how a family is structured. What is the role of your mother and mother-in-law? How many children are you expected to have? Are women supposed to get a secondary education or not? I mean, there's just a whole series of cultural things that are different, right? The European Jews, the Zionists had come mostly from Europe, looked down on the Mizrahi. The Mizrahi Jews were considered primitive. And so one of the things I have for you to show you is this is a recent thing. And so I'm going to stop share for a moment and then show you a new thing because I thought you'd appreciate this. This is a group called Ewa, and they are Yemenite, and they are, several generations from removed, but they're writing songs and singing in Arabic about their experience of having come to Israel. So I'm going to make this large and play it for you so you get a sense of what it's like. I hope you can see it. So there, I got. Okay, so hopefully you could see some of the subtitles on that, where they're basically, you know, like what's happening is these are direct descendants of that Operation Magic Carpet from which rescued, 47,000, I think it was 47,000 Yemenites, Jews from Yemen. And what happens to them is they get put into tents and into a tent city, or then eventually moved into shacks. You heard about that they share with 4 other families. And part of what happens is the dominant culture, which was Ashkenazi, thought that the Yemenites were primitive, partly because like in our book, it has a picture of the Yemenite women, and it says many of them had never even seen a plane before. And you're like, and so this is sort of the dominant narrative, is that they're primitive and they don't know anything about modern life, and they have to be like, and the comment you might have also noticed about, there was a comment of, don't let them take your daughter. There was actually a case of where the children were getting adopted out of Yemenite families, taken in this way, like that is the actual thing, and had happened when the Yemenites arrived. And so there was a formal apology done not too long ago along these lines of saying, this isn't what should have happened. But I thought one of the reasons why I wanted to do that was I wanted them to tell you, let the Yemenites speak for themselves. And it's a beautiful video. I mean, like this is pop music, but it's also, it tells a history, it tells a story. Those are three sisters, by the way, the women who are dressed, through most of their videos, they tend to be dressed traditionally, although they don't just dress traditionally, just in their videos, they tend to. And they usually sing in Arabic. And so, because the Yemenites, that's what they spoke. Yes, Nancy.
Were the Yemenites and the Iraqis that were Jewish, did they leave their country to come to Jerusalem or Israel because of forces that were happening in their country?
Yeah, they were getting forced out. So the two unpleasant truths of this establishment of Israel was that the Israelis forced Arabs out of their homes to create the land of Israel in the course of the War of Independence, and the Arab countries surrounding Israel forced Jews out of their homes in retaliation, or might not have been retaliation, even if I'm not sure if the Israelis had allowed the Arabs to stay there, that the others would have been allowed to stay, but also forced Jews out. So both have people who've been removed from their homes. In the case of the Mizrahi, the ones who are the Jews from Arabic lands, they find a home in Israel. They become refugees within Israel and get absorbed, sort of. I mean, in the sense of you can see in that song remaining, wounds, I think is the right word, from that experience. It wasn't a perfect process by any means, and that still, that tension still exists. In the case of the Palestinian refugees, they're still Palestinian refugees. That continues to this day. There were also Palestinians who were within the country itself. So, and then later what happens is in 1967, when Israel takes over territories that had previously been under the management of Jordan, as in the case of the Old City and the West Bank, and in the case of the Gaza Strip, that's Egypt. They also take over Sinai, and they also take over Golan, which had been controlled by Syria. What ends up happening is some of that land, eventually there's a conversation in land for peace, in the case of Egypt with the Sinai Peninsula. But with the other locations, there wasn't that conversation. And early Israeli politicians thought that call would come in and they'd say, hey, let's negotiate, but it didn't. And then over time, what's happened is facts on the ground, Israel really fundamentally controls that. Where we're at now is we actually have a situation where there's 7 million Jews living in Israel. And then if you count also the territories, there are 7 million Palestinians living there as well. So you can also hear in that, remember when we started with the UN partition plan, what was the ratio?
There were very few Jews, twice as many.
1 to 2, right? Right. The Jewish population was 1 to 2. And between the immigration, because, that's a massive immigration wave. And then Israel has a fairly high birth rate as modern nations go, higher than say the rest of the West, and through policy. And so now it's 1 to 1.
Yeah.
Although, Palestinian birth rate is also high. And so one of the concerns is that it won't always be 1-to-1. So, so the demographics of that is challenging. So hopefully I've been able to present this in a way that is not, that is fair. So, other questions?
The situation in Yemen was not good. I mean,
No, the Yemenite Jews could not stay. It would not have been good. And so it was a rescue. That's part of the reason why, in the song you hear that, you were my last resort. I was fleeing, they're making it clear that, so there is a gratitude of sorts in it, in the sense of, I was a stranger, I was fleeing, you were my last resort. And maybe what I'll do, so that's how the song sort of unfolds. I was a stranger, I was fleeing, you were my last resort. Maybe I'll get a tent or a house, maybe I'll live in a tent or a house. And then they're like, with 4 other families, maybe I'll get an income, and they're like cleaning houses or working the earth. Maybe I'll have a family, and they're like, don't let them take your daughter. You hear in it this, both the hope of the refugee, the desperation of the refugee, and also some of the realities of the refugee. And so, so it's a challenge. Great group though. I'm a fan. And they're not the only ones. There's a lot of really interesting things going on in both the Israeli cinema, television, music. Like, one of the interesting things is things that American Jews find challenging to talk about, Israelis will talk about all the time. If you're willing to watch Hebrew language stuff, and a lot of it has subtitles, you'll suddenly hear a whole different story than what's dominant in the American Jewish conversation. They're willing to look at difficult things.
And a lot of Israeli television is really good.
Oh my goodness. Now, the funniest thing on Israeli television that I know of anyways, the Jews are coming. Hysterically funny and totally irreverent. It takes Bible stories and turns them on their head. The Jews are coming. You want to check it out. It's really
They might have it on YouTube, huh?
They totally have it on YouTube. It's absolutely hilarious. If I can find a good reason to show you one of them, I will. Yeah. The good place to start is Google or look on YouTube. The Jews Are Coming. That's the name of the show. And the one of the funniest ones to see, and I know it is in English subtitles, is the one on Esther.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, totally irreverent. You have been warned. Totally irreverent, really funny. So, okay, so then we are actually at 5:01. I'm going to stop our recording, and